Michael Harris had not been back to his hometown in nearly a decade. The narrow roads of rural Pennsylvania carried him past cornfields that had grown taller since his last visit, past brick churches with white steeples that seemed unchanged, and toward the old Harris house that stood stubbornly at the edge of town. It was a typical two-story American home, painted white with blue shutters, its wooden porch sagging under years of neglect. Yet what made it different, at least to Michael, was the secret that had always lingered just above its ceilings, the attic his father never allowed anyone to enter. As a boy, Michael remembered running his fingers across the old brass doorknob, fascinated by the mystery behind it. His father's voice would thunder from downstairs. "Stay away from there, Michael. That door is not to be touched." The words were final, sharp and heavy with unspoken consequences. That warning shaped his childhood as much as baseball games in the summer heat or Sunday dinners after church. The attic was forbidden, and the more forbidden it became, the more it haunted his imagination. Now, returning at 32 for his father's funeral, Michael carried not just grief, but also a gnawing sense of unfinished business. He stepped onto the porch, keys in hand, inhaling the smell of damp wood and autumn leaves. The house felt heavy with silence. Inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards seemed louder than before, echoing like whispers of the past. His mother, Elizabeth, waited in the kitchen, her eyes tired, her voice soft. She offered him coffee, as though routine could hold back the storm of emotions building between them. Before we go further into Michael's story, let me invite you to subscribe to the channel. Here we share gripping real-life stories filled with mystery, emotion, and discovery. Subscribing ensures you don't miss the next chapter in journeys like this one. Michael set his suitcase down by the staircase, his gaze instinctively rising to the narrow wooden door above. Dust collected on its frame, untouched, as though even time itself obeyed David Harris's rule. The attic loomed not as a space for old furniture or forgotten toys, but as a locked chamber of truth sealed under the authority of a man whose presence was still felt even in death. The day stretched into evening as relatives and neighbors arrived for the funeral service preparations. Conversations drifted about the weather, the arrangements, the flowers, anything but the attic. Michael noticed how carefully people avoided speaking of his father beyond polite memories. David Harris had been respected but feared as well. A man of strict discipline, he worked long hours as a contractor, provided for his family but demanded obedience without question. To most, he was reliable. To Michael, he was a puzzle whose edges never seemed to fit. That night, lying awake in his childhood room, Michael stared at the ceiling. The sound of crickets outside mixed with the ticking of the old clock in the hall. He felt the same unease he once had as a boy, when he believed voices came from the attic late at night. Back then, his father dismissed it as imagination. But the memory returned sharper now, layered with regret that he had never challenged the silence. His return to this house wasn't just about grieving, it was about facing the weight of rules that had shaped his life. The attic stood above him like a question that had waited decades for an answer. He wondered what his father had been so determined to keep hidden, and why the thought of opening that door filled him with equal parts dread and determination. The funeral awaited him tomorrow. Family obligations demanded his focus. Yet even as he closed his eyes, Michael knew the shadow of the attic would not leave him. The rule that once defined his childhood had become the riddle of his adulthood, and now, with his father gone, there was nothing stopping him from seeking the truth, except his own fear of what he might find. And still the silence of that house seemed to whisper, some doors should never be opened. The morning of the funeral arrived with a pale gray sky stretching over the quiet Pennsylvania town. Rain had threatened all night, but never came, leaving the air damp and heavy. Michael dressed in the same dark suit he had worn to college graduations and weddings, a suit that now carried a weight it had never known before. As he tied his black tie in the cracked mirror of his childhood bedroom, his eyes flicked upward again to the attic door above the stairs. Its silence pressed down on him like a question he wasn't ready to answer. Downstairs, the house buzzed with the subdued activity of relatives gathering. Elizabeth moved quietly among them, her black dress simple, her hair pinned back neatly. Her face betrayed little, but her silence spoke volumes. When Michael approached her, she placed a hand on his arm with a softness that carried both love and restraint. "Mom," he said, his voice low. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Michael," she replied, though her eyes remained fixed on the coffee pot she was pouring from. "We do what we must. Your father would want us to stay strong." His sister, Claire, arrived shortly after, her husband and 2 small children in tow. Claire had always been the dutiful one, the peacemaker. She hugged Michael tightly, whispering, "It feels strange without him here, doesn't it?" Michael nodded but said nothing. Words felt heavy, like stones he couldn't lift. The conversation in the room swirled around them, memories of David's work ethic, his dedication to the community, his strict way of living. But no one spoke of the attic. Not once. The omission hung in the air, as loud as a church bell, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that everyone knew more than they were willing to say. The service at the small brick church passed in a blur of hymns, condolences, and solemn handshakes. Michael shook hands, nodded politely, and listened to neighbors recount how dependable his father had been, how he always paid his debts, how he never let anyone down. Yet beneath each kind word, Michael felt an undercurrent of tension, as if people were tiptoeing around something unsaid. Later, when they returned home for the gathering, Elizabeth retreated into the kitchen. Michael found her at the counter, slicing bread with slow, careful movements. "Mom," he said softly, "why did Dad care so much about that attic?" The knife paused mid-slice. For a moment she didn't look at him. Then she placed the bread aside and answered, "Your father had his reasons. Some things were never meant to be disturbed." "That's not an answer," Michael pressed, his frustration rising. "He's gone now. We deserve to know the truth." Elizabeth's eyes finally met his, filled with a mixture of sorrow and warning. "Michael, please, let it rest. There are memories best left buried." The words cut deeper than he expected. Memories best left buried. What could be so dangerous, so shameful, that even now she begged him to turn away? Later that evening, the family gathered in the living room. A local lawyer arrived to read David Harris's will. Michael listened carefully, expecting to hear instructions about finances, the house, or small family heirlooms. Instead, what struck him most were the final lines. "The house and its contents belong to Elizabeth. My one request is that what remains above not be disturbed." The words sent a shiver through Michael. Even in death, his father had chained the attic shut with his authority. Claire lowered her gaze, as if unwilling to meet his eyes. Elizabeth sat rigid, her face expressionless. Michael leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. That single instruction echoed louder than everything else. His father's voice commanding him once more, "Stay away." But as Michael glanced upward toward the ceiling, he knew this silence couldn't hold forever. Night descended heavy and still over the Harris house, the kind of darkness that pressed against the windows and magnified every creak of the old wood. Michael lay awake in his childhood bed, staring at the faint light from the street lamp outside. His father's last words, carved into the will, echoed relentlessly, "Do not disturb what is above." The attic seemed to breathe over him, its presence impossible to ignore. He sat up, running a hand over his face, restless. The air inside felt thick, as though the house itself guarded secrets. Down the hallway, his mother slept, and Claire had taken her children to a relative's home for the night. Michael was alone with silence, and silence gave space to temptation. His gaze fixed on the attic door. The wood looked the same as it had when he was 10, sturdy, stubborn, coated with layers of old paint. Only now he noticed the padlock, rusted but firm, dangling from the latch like a sentinel. It mocked him, daring him to defy his father even after death. With slow steps he approached. The floorboards beneath his feet groaned, a reminder of the nights he once crept down this hall as a boy. He reached for the lock, testing it with his fingers. It was cold, rough, and immovable. His pulse quickened, his breath shallow. For a fleeting second, he imagined the sound of his father's voice thundering behind him, warning him to step away. But there was no voice now, only his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. A sudden noise startled him. Something shifted above, faint but undeniable, as if weight moved across the attic floor. Michael froze. His eyes darted upward. He held his breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, softer this time, then silence. "Old houses make noises," he whispered to himself, though the words sounded hollow. He backed away, the urge to flee battling with curiosity. The next morning, he sat in the kitchen, sipping coffee, while Elizabeth busied herself with cleaning dishes. He debated whether to bring up what he'd heard, but chose silence. She looked fragile, and pressing her further felt cruel. Yet the attic's presence gnawed at him, making it hard to focus on anything else. Later in the afternoon, he stepped outside, seeking escape in the crisp autumn air. Leaves crunched under his shoes as he walked down the quiet street. That's when he heard someone call his name. "Michael Harris?" Turning, he saw a familiar face, Sarah Miller. She had been his neighbor and closest friend growing up, the girl who had always dared him to climb trees higher than he should, and who knew how to laugh away fear. Now, at 31, she carried the same confident energy, her smile bright, despite the years apart. "Sarah," he said, surprised but relieved, "it's been forever." "Too long," she agreed, giving him a warm hug. "I heard about your father. I'm sorry." "Thank you," Michael replied. The words weighted with more than grief. "It's complicated being back here." They walked along the sidewalk, catching up on the years gone by. Sarah spoke of her work at the local library, her love of the town's quiet rhythm. When Michael finally mentioned the attic, her expression sharpened. "Your dad never let us near that place," she said. "Remember when we tried to sneak up there? He scared us so badly I thought I'd never breathe again." Michael laughed softly, though the memory still carried unease. "Yeah, and even now it's locked up tight. I tried last night, and I swear I heard something moving up there." Sarah tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "Michael, maybe it's time you find out why. Your father's gone, whatever's in that attic. Maybe it's meant for you to uncover." Her words lingered, both a comfort and a challenge. Michael felt the tension coil tighter inside him. He had always imagined the attic as a place of shadows and unanswered questions, but now, with Sarah back in his life and the house pressing its silence upon him, the idea of unlocking it became less about curiosity and more about necessity. He glanced back at the house, the attic window barely visible beneath the roofline. Something waited up there, and though fear weighed heavy, the pull of truth was stronger. For the first time, he felt the decision forming within him. The attic would not stay closed forever. That night, Michael found himself wandering through the dimly lit hallways of the house, restless after his talk with Sarah. Her words echoed in his mind. "Maybe it's time you find out why." He had always told himself his father's rules were born of discipline, not fear. But now he wondered if David Harris had been protecting himself more than anyone else. As Michael passed the staircase, his eyes lingered on the attic door. In the silence, childhood memories surfaced unbidden, as vivid as if no time had passed. He was 8 years old again, standing barefoot in his pajamas on the landing, clutching a flashlight. That night, he had been certain he heard voices drifting from above, muffled, low, like conversations carried through the floorboards. "Dad, someone's up there," he had whispered nervously when his father stormed out of his room to catch him. David's reaction was not comfort, but fury. He had seized Michael's wrist so tightly it left red marks. "There is nothing up there," he hissed, eyes blazing with something that wasn't just anger, but fear. "And if you ever say otherwise, you'll regret it." The memory made Michael shudder. He could still recall lying in bed afterward, the sting on his wrist throbbing and wondering why his father's voice shook, as if he were the one afraid. Now, years later, Michael leaned against the banister, lost in thought. The house around him was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made ordinary sounds, pipes groaning, wood shifting, feel sinister. Every creak of the attic above seemed to demand his attention. In the kitchen, Elizabeth sat with a cup of tea, her face pale in the lamplight. When Michael joined her, he noticed how tightly she held the cup, as if it grounded her. "Mum," he began carefully, "do you remember when I was a kid, and I said I heard voices in the attic?" Her hand froze halfway to her lips. For a moment she didn't answer. Then she set the cup down and shook her head faintly. Children imagine things. Old houses make noises. That's exactly what Dad used to say, Michael pressed, his voice low but firm. But I know what I heard, and I remember his face when I told him. He wasn't just angry, he was scared. Elizabeth's eyes clouded. She looked away, toward the dark window. Your father carried many burdens, Michael. He didn't always know how to handle them. That's not enough, Michael insisted. He scared me into silence. I spent years wondering what I had done wrong, why I wasn't allowed to ask questions. That attic... He trailed off, his jaw tightening. I need to know what's up there. Elizabeth reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Her palm was warm, trembling slightly. Some truths don't bring peace, she whispered. They only bring more questions. Her words struck him deeply, but instead of calming his doubts, they sharpened them. If nothing dangerous was hidden in the attic, why would she still cling to silence after all these years? That night, Michael tried to sleep, but his mind replayed the memory of his father's grip on his wrist, the tremor in his voice, the voices that had seemed so real. He turned in bed, staring at the ceiling. Each tick of the clock felt like a countdown, each whisper of wind against the shutters, a reminder that time was running out for secrets to remain buried. The fear he felt as a boy had never left him. It had only been buried beneath years of distance and adulthood. And now, standing again in the house that had shaped him, that fear returned in full force mixed with something stronger. Determination. The attic wasn't just a locked room anymore. It was a wound, an unanswered question that pulsed in the silence of the house. And Michael knew the only way forward was to face it, no matter what waited behind that door. By the third night back in his childhood home, Michael felt like the walls were closing in. The house had always been strict, but now it was suffocating. Every corner carried a memory of rules he couldn't question, words he couldn't say, and that locked attic door staring down at him like a dare. His father was gone, but the command still lived in the silence of the house. Do not disturb what is above. Michael sat at the kitchen table with Sarah, who had stopped by after work. They drank coffee from mismatched mugs, the steam curling in the dim light. She leaned forward, her voice steady, eyes searching his. You can't keep circling it forever, she said. You already tried the lock once. If your father's not here to stop you, what's holding you back? My mother, Michael admitted quietly. She doesn't want me to. She begged me to let it go. Sarah's tone softened, but her words didn't waver. Michael, she's grieving. Of course she doesn't want to stir up more pain, but grief doesn't erase truth, and you, she pointed at him firmly, you need answers. You've needed them since you were a kid. Her words hit home. He rubbed his temples, thinking of the voices he once heard, the fury in his father's eyes, the fear in his mother's silence, all of it twisted together into a knot he could no longer ignore. I'm afraid, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Not of what I'll find, but of what it'll mean. What if everything I thought about him changes? Sarah reached across the table, her hand brushing his. It already has. Whether you open that door or not, you'll never see him the same way again. Her honesty gave him courage. Later that night, when Elizabeth had gone to bed, Michael stood in the hallway with Sarah beside him. The attic door loomed above, padlocked and still. Dust coated the hinges, and cobwebs framed the corners, untouched for decades. Sarah crossed her arms. You ready? Michael hesitated, staring at the padlock. Not really. But I have to be. They tried at first with bare hands, tugging the lock, shaking the latch, but it held fast. The metal groaned but didn't break. Sarah disappeared downstairs and returned with an old hammer she found in the basement. You hit it, she said, handing it to him. Michael gripped the handle, his palms slick with sweat. He raised it high, hesitated, then brought it down hard. The clang echoed through the house louder than he expected, and he froze, waiting for his mother's voice to come calling, but the silence held. Another strike, then another. The lock rattled, metal bending under the force. With one final blow, it snapped, crashing to the wooden steps. Michael's chest heaved with the effort, and for a moment he stood frozen, staring at the broken lock at his feet. He pushed the door open slowly. The hinges squealed in protest, releasing the smell of dust and time. The beam of Sarah's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing boxes stacked high, old trunks, and furniture draped with yellowing sheets. The air was thick, stale, carrying the faint scent of mothballs and something metallic. Michael stepped inside cautiously, his shoes crunching on a layer of grit. He felt the weight of decades pressing down, each object a silent witness to the life his father had hidden. In the far corner, Sarah's light caught on a large trunk, its surface scarred and worn. The initials DH were carved into the wood. "Michael," Sarah whispered, pointing. "That has to be his." He moved toward it slowly, his heart pounding. Kneeling before the trunk, he ran his hand over the letters, the grooves rough beneath his fingertips. A heavy padlock secured it shut, larger and sturdier than the one that had guarded the door. "Looks like he really didn't want anyone opening this," Sarah murmured. Michael stared at the lock, his chest tight. Whatever was inside, his father had guarded it with his last ounce of control. He rose to his feet, unease coiling in his stomach. The attic had opened, but the real secret still waited, and for the first time, Michael understood that this was only the beginning. Michael barely slept after breaking into the attic. His mind replayed the sound of the lock snapping, the creak of the old door, and the sight of the trunk sitting like a sentinel in the corner. He had expected some dusty relics, maybe his father's tools or forgotten family belongings. Instead, he had found something intentional, deliberate, and still protected, the trunk with his father's initials carved deep into the wood. The following afternoon, when Elizabeth went to visit a neighbor, Michael and Sarah climbed the narrow steps again. Dust filled the air, thick and dry, coating their throats. Sarah held the flashlight steady, while Michael opened the boxes stacked near the trunk. He needed to understand the attic before daring to face the lock that guarded the biggest secret. Inside the first box were photo albums, black and white pictures of family gatherings, Christmas mornings, and neighborhood barbecues. Michael flipped through them quickly, recognizing faces of cousins and neighbors. But tucked beneath the albums were loose photographs that didn't belong. These showed his father, much younger, standing with men Michael had never seen before. They were dressed in plain clothes, but their expressions were hard, their postures stiff. None of them smiled. "Do you know who these people are?" Sarah asked, leaning closer. Michael shook his head. "Not family, at least not anyone I've met." He pulled another photograph from the pile. This one showed his father standing outside a warehouse, his arm around one of the unfamiliar men. On the back, written in blocky handwriting, was a year 1984. Sarah frowned. "Why would your dad keep these hidden up here instead of with the family albums?" Michael didn't answer. His stomach churned. He set the photos aside and dug deeper into the boxes. The next one contained old notebooks, their pages filled with numbers and short notes. Many were written in shorthand, barely legible. Some pages listed names alongside dates, while others were filled with strings of numbers that looked like codes. "Looks like records of some kind," Sarah murmured, flipping through one carefully. "But records of what?" Michael's pulse quickened as he opened another box. Inside were folded newspapers, yellowed with age. He spread one out, reading the headline, "Local man missing after business deal gone wrong." Another, "Authorities investigate series of disappearances." The dates ranged from the early to mid-1980s, the same years scribbled inside the notebooks. Sarah's face hardened. "Michael, this isn't just family history, this is serious. Your dad was keeping track of something, or someone." Michael sat back on his heels, running his hand through his hair. His father, the strict man who never broke rules, who demanded obedience and discipline, what had he been involved in that required hiding boxes of coded notes and news clippings in a locked attic? He turned to the trunk again, its heavy lock glinting in the flashlight's beam. His chest tightened. Whatever was inside had to be even more important than the photographs and notebooks. His father hadn't just hidden it. He had buried it in secrecy. "I need to know what's in there," Michael said, his voice steady but low. "Michael," Sarah cautioned, "if this is what it looks like, you might be opening more than just a trunk." "This could be dangerous." He nodded, though his eyes never left the lock. "I know, but I can't stop now." That evening, Elizabeth returned and noticed the dust on his clothes. Her expression darkened, and she asked quietly, "You've been upstairs, haven't you?" Michael didn't deny it. "Yes, and I found things, Mom, photographs, notes, newspapers about missing people." What was Dad hiding? Her lips tightened, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She shook her head, whispering, "Don't go further, please. Some truths will only hurt you." But Michael couldn't turn back. The attic had shifted from mystery to obligation. He knew he was standing on the edge of a revelation, and stepping away would only chain him to silence forever. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Harris house felt heavier than the overcast sky pressing down on the small town. Michael sat at the dining table, a stack of the photographs and notes spread before him. His hands hovered over the papers, unable to let them go but afraid of holding them too tightly, as though the truth might burn through his skin. Elizabeth entered quietly, her face pale, her eyes avoiding the table. She carried herself with the weight of someone who had fought a battle through the night and lost. Michael looked at her and decided he couldn't keep the silence any longer. "Mom," he began, his voice steady, "I know you've been trying to protect us. But I've seen enough to know Dad wasn't who I thought he was." Elizabeth flinched, her hands clutching the edge of the counter. "Don't say that, Michael. Your father worked hard for this family. He gave us everything." "He gave us rules," Michael replied sharply, his frustration spilling out. "Rules about where to go, what to say, what not to ask. He gave us silence. And now I'm finding photographs of him with strangers, coded notebooks, articles about people who disappeared." He leaned forward, his eyes burning into hers. "Tell me the truth. Who was he really?" Her lips trembled. She looked older in that moment, the lines on her face deeper, her shoulders stooped under the weight of memories she had carried alone. Finally she whispered, "Your father got involved with men he should never have trusted. Dangerous men. It started before you were born, and by the time he realized the cost, it was too late." Michael's chest tightened. "So he was part of whatever they were doing?" Elizabeth shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "At first, yes, but later, he wanted out. He wanted to protect us. That's why he locked the attic. He kept everything hidden, evidence of what those men had done, things they couldn't afford to see the light of day. He thought keeping it here, under his control, was safer than turning it over." Michael's voice cracked. "You knew." Her gaze dropped. "I knew enough to be afraid. But your father swore to me it was the only way to keep us safe. If anyone ever came looking, he'd have leverage. He said as long as the attic stayed locked, no one would question it." Michael sat back, his stomach twisting. His father, the man who had punished him for even touching the doorknob, had been fighting a silent war in the shadows of their home. Yet instead of relief, anger welled up inside him. "All those years," he said bitterly. "You let me believe I was just disobedient, that I was the problem, when really Dad was hiding from something bigger than us all." Elizabeth reached for his hand, but he pulled it away. "I wanted to tell you," she said softly. "But how could I? You were just a child, and later I prayed it would never matter. I prayed the attic would stay closed forever." Michael stood abruptly, pacing the room. "It matters now. He's gone, and whatever he was hiding is still here. If those men are still out there, don't you think they'll come looking?" Elizabeth's silence was answer enough. At that moment, Claire walked in, carrying her youngest on her hip. She stopped, sensing the tension. "What's going on?" Michael glanced at her, then at the child in her arms, and swallowed hard. "We're talking about Dad, about what he left behind." Claire frowned, but before she could press further, Elizabeth spoke quickly, her voice firm. "Enough for today. There's no need to drag this into the open, not in front of the children." Michael clenched his jaw. He knew his mother wanted to bury the truth, to shield them with silence as she always had. But the attic had already spoken. The secrets were out, and they wouldn't go quietly back into the dark. The following day, Michael woke with the photographs still spread across his desk. The house was quiet, but his mind buzzed with the weight of what his mother had confessed. The more he stared at the images of his father with those unsmiling men, the more he realized he couldn't carry this alone. Secrets didn't stay buried forever, and if his father had once been tied to dangerous men, then the attic was more than just a family mystery. It was a risk. Sarah stopped by again in the afternoon, her concern obvious the moment she stepped through the door. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said, eyeing the papers scattered across the table. "I haven't," Michael admitted. "I keep thinking about what my mom told me. If my father was involved with these people, if he was keeping records of them, then someone else must know. Someone else might be looking for this stuff." "Then you can't sit on it any longer," Sarah replied firmly. "You need help, real help." Michael hesitated. Involving outsiders felt like betrayal, like tearing down the last shield his father had built. But he knew Sarah was right. He needed someone who could look at the evidence with clear eyes. That evening, Michael drove into town. The streets were familiar yet strange, lined with diners, hardware stores, and the same faded billboards from his youth. He parked outside the brick building of the local police department, his chest tight with dread. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. At the front desk, he asked for Detective Alan Morris, a name Sarah had suggested. "He's fair," she had said, "not the kind to sweep things under the rug." Minutes later, Morris entered the small waiting room. He was in his mid-40s, tall, with a calm but watchful gaze. His dark suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, but his presence carried quiet authority. "You're David Harris's son, aren't you?" Morris asked, offering a firm handshake. "Yes." "Michael," he replied, gripping his hand. I need to talk to you about something I found in my father's house." In a small office lined with case files, Michael spread out the photographs, notebooks, and clippings across the desk. Morris leaned forward, studying each piece with deliberate care. His brow furrowed as he read, his eyes sharp with recognition. "Where exactly did you find these?" Morris asked, his voice calm but edged with seriousness. "In the attic, locked away." Morris tapped one of the photographs with his finger. "That man there, Richard Cole. I've had his name on my desk more than once over the years. He's been suspected in fraud, extortion, even connections to disappearances in the 80s. But no one's ever been able to pin anything solid on him." Michael's throat went dry. "You're saying my father knew him?" "More than knew him," Morris said, leaning back. "If these documents are authentic, your father was right in the middle of something. And judging from the way he kept it hidden, I'd say he wasn't proud of it." Michael swallowed hard. His father's image, once stern and untouchable, grew more complicated with every word. "Detective," he asked carefully, "if Cole is still out there and he finds out I have this, am I in danger?" Morris studied him for a moment before answering. "I won't lie to you, son. If Cole thinks you have evidence that could bury him, you'd better believe he won't like it. But the good news is, now it's not just on your shoulders. You brought it to me. That was the right call." Michael nodded, though his stomach twisted. For years he had obeyed his father's rule of silence. Now he had broken it, and the consequences were no longer just whispers in the night. They were real, and they were coming closer. The drive back from the police station was slow, every passing car making Michael glance nervously at the rearview mirror. His conversation with Detective Morris kept replaying in his head, his father's connection to Richard Cole, the warning that Cole wouldn't tolerate loose ends. By the time he pulled into the driveway of the Harris house, the weight of fear pressed on him like a storm cloud ready to break. Inside, the house felt colder than usual. Elizabeth sat in the living room with her knitting, though her hands trembled enough to unravel her work. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with unspoken questions. "Where were you?" she asked quietly. Michael hesitated before answering. "I showed some of Dad's things to the police. I needed help understanding them." Elizabeth's face paled, her lips parting in shock. "You what?" "Michael, you don't know what you've done. If those men are still watching, if they hear about this—" "I can't keep pretending," he interrupted. "We've lived under Dad's silence long enough." I had to take a step forward. Before she could respond, the sound of the mailbox lid clattering shut echoed through the quiet night. Michael frowned, walking to the door. He pulled out a plain envelope, no stamp, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with block letters scrawled across it. "Leave the attic closed or you'll regret it." His breath caught. He read it twice, then 3 times, his hands tightening around the paper. Someone knew. Elizabeth's voice wavered from behind him. "Michael, what is it?" He turned, holding the letter out. Her eyes scanned the words, and she sank into a chair, her face drained of color. "It's starting again," she whispered. "I told your father this would never end." Michael clenched his jaw, fury cutting through his fear. "So they're watching us. They know I've been in the attic. That means they've been close enough to see." Later that evening, Sarah came by after work. Michael showed her the letter and she read it with a frown. "This is a threat," she said flatly. "Whoever sent it wants you scared enough to back off, but that only proves you're onto something real." Michael rubbed his temples, the exhaustion settling deep in his bones. "I can't put my mom or Claire's kids at risk. What if these people try something worse?" Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "You're not alone in this. You've got Morris now and you've got me. We'll face it together." "But Michael, you have to decide. Do you walk away like your father did, or do you see this through?" The question lingered long after she left. Michael sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the folded letter on the table. He thought about his father's command, the years of fear that had ruled their home, and the trunk still locked in the attic. His father had chosen silence, but Michael wasn't sure he could. Late into the night, he paced the halls, listening to the creaks above. The attic seemed alive, its secrets no longer content to stay hidden. Every shadow outside the window looked like someone watching. Every car passing down the street made his pulse race. Yet beneath the fear, determination flickered. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "If they think they can scare me into silence, they don't know me." But even as he spoke the words, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the battle his father had tried to avoid was now at his doorstep, and there would be no turning back. The morning after the letter arrived, Michael woke to the sound of voices in the kitchen. Elizabeth and Claire were speaking in hushed tones, but the urgency carried through the thin walls. He lingered at the top of the stairs, listening. "You should have burned everything years ago," Claire said, her voice sharp with fear. "Now it's all coming back and we're the ones who will pay." Elizabeth's reply was quiet but firm. "Your father believed it was safer to keep it hidden. He thought if he had proof they couldn't touch us." Michael stepped into the room, his presence startling them both. "Proof of what?" he demanded. "I need answers, and I need them now." Elizabeth's shoulders sagged, as though she had carried this burden for too long. She gestured for him to sit, her eyes tired. "Your father wasn't always the man you remember. In his 20s, he got involved with men like Richard Cole. They promised money, influence, things he thought would give us security. At first he believed them, but when he saw what they were capable of, what they were willing to do to people who got in their way, he wanted out." Claire shook her head in disbelief. "And instead of walking away, he brought all of it into this house?" Elizabeth's voice trembled. "He thought if he kept records, ledgers, photographs, evidence, he could protect us. He said one day it might even bring Cole down. But he also knew it made us a target. That's why he locked the attic. That's why he told us never to go near it. He was protecting us in the only way he knew." Michael leaned back, his chest tight. "So everything I've been finding, the notebooks, the photos, that was his way of building a case?" Elizabeth nodded. "Yes. But he was also afraid. Afraid that if he ever tried to use it, we'd pay the price. So he chose silence." Michael stared at her, the weight of betrayal mixing with pity. His whole life his father had acted like the house rules were about discipline and obedience, when in reality they were about fear. Fear of Richard Cole, fear of exposure, fear of what the truth would do to the family. "And what about the trunk?" he asked carefully. Elizabeth's gaze faltered. That holds the worst of it. Documents, letters, maybe even confessions. I never looked. I didn't want to know. Your father said as long as it stayed locked, we were safe." Claire slammed her hand on the table, her frustration spilling over. "Safe? Do you call this safe? We've got people threatening us, watching us, because Dad couldn't let go of his past." Michael stood, pacing the room. He didn't let go because he knew someday it would catch up with us, and it has. Now it's on me to decide what to do." The room fell silent, the tension thick. Elizabeth's eyes pleaded with him. "Michael, please, don't go any further. I already lost your father to this. I can't lose you too." Her words hit hard, but Michael knew he was already too deep. The letter had made it clear. Someone was watching, waiting, determined to keep the attic closed. If he stopped now, the fear would never end. Later that night he stood alone at the bottom of the attic stairs, the flashlight in his hand. The trunk sat at the far end, its lock glinting in the beam. His father's initials carved into the wood seemed to mock him, daring him to finish what had been started. The silence pressed heavy, broken only by his own breathing. For years, the attic had been a symbol of his father's control. Now it was something else entirely, the key to understanding the life David Harris had lived and the danger he had left behind. Michael tightened his grip on the flashlight. One way or another, the truth was going to surface. It was just past midnight when Michael woke to a sound that didn't belong. At first he thought it was part of a dream, the rattle of glass, the subtle thump of a door against its frame. But then he heard footsteps, real, deliberate, and inside the house. His pulse surged as he sat upright, straining to listen. The air was heavy with silence broken only by faint creaks on the floorboards below. Someone was moving carefully, trying not to be noticed. Michael slipped out of bed and grabbed the baseball bat leaning against the wall. The weight of it was comforting, though his hands trembled. He opened his door slowly, the hallway dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. From downstairs came another sound, the squeal of hinges, the shuffle of boxes. His stomach dropped. The attic. Someone was searching the attic. Michael crept down the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. He could hear his mother's soft breathing from her room. Thankfully, she hadn't stirred. At the base of the stairs, he saw it. The attic door stood open, a narrow beam of flashlight cutting through the dust. Rage surged through his fear. That attic had haunted his life, belonged to his father's silence, and now strangers were invading it. He tightened his grip on the bat and whispered harshly, "Who's up there?" The noises stopped instantly. For a heartbeat, the house went still. Then, heavy footsteps pounded across the attic floor. Whoever it was had no intention of hiding now. Michael charged forward, climbing the steps two at a time. When he reached the attic entrance, the beam of the flashlight swung wildly, then disappeared as the intruder fled deeper into the shadows. Michael followed, the dust choking his throat, boxes crashing as the stranger shoved them aside. He caught a glimpse of a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothes, a mask pulled over his face. Michael raised the bat, ready to swing, but the man bolted toward the far window. With one powerful motion, he shoved it open and leapt onto the roof, disappearing into the night. Michael stopped at the window, breathless, his chest heaving. The cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of leaves and damp earth. He could still hear the intruder's footsteps pounding across the shingles before fading into the distance. "Michael!" Elizabeth's voice came from below, panicked. "What's happening?" He closed the window and rushed back downstairs, still gripping the bat. Someone was here. They were in the attic. Elizabeth's face turned ashen, her hands clutching the edge of the banister for support. "I told you this would happen," she whispered. "I told you they'd come." Michael forced himself to stay calm, though adrenaline still surged through him. "The trunk," he said quickly, racing back up the stairs. He shone a flashlight into the attic, scanning the mess. Boxes were overturned, papers scattered, but the trunk remained untouched, its heavy lock still secure. Sarah arrived minutes later, woken by Michael's urgent call. She stepped into the attic, eyes wide as she took in the chaos. "They were looking for it," she said, pointing to the trunk. "They know what's in there, and they're desperate to get to it before you do." Michael wiped the sweat from his brow, his jaw set. "Then we can't wait any longer. If they're willing to break in, it's only a matter of time before they try again. We need to open it before they do." Elizabeth's voice cracked from the doorway. "If you open that trunk, you'll unleash everything your father tried to hold back. Do you understand what you're inviting into our lives?" Michael met her eyes, his own steady. "It's already here, Mom." The only difference now is whether we face it or keep running from it." The words hung heavy in the dust-filled air. The attic, once silent and sealed, had been invaded. And now there was no denying it. Whatever his father had hidden was worth breaking into their home for. The attic still bore the scars of the break-in. Boxes were overturned, papers scattered across the floor, dust swirling in the beam of Michael's flashlight. But none of that mattered. All eyes were fixed on the trunk in the corner, its lock still heavy and intact. Michael crouched before it, running his hand over the carved initials. D.H., his father's mark, both familiar and alien. For a moment he hesitated, hearing Elizabeth's warning echo in his head. "If you open that trunk, you'll unleash everything your father tried to hold back." But the image of the masked intruder crashing through their attic window hardened his resolve. Sarah stood close by, her arms crossed tightly. "If they were after this, then whatever's inside is the key. We can't wait for them to come back." Elizabeth lingered in the doorway, her face pale. "Please, Michael. Once you see what's in there, you can't unsee it. Your father carried that weight until it broke him. Do you really want to carry it too?" Michael didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed the crowbar Sarah had brought from the basement. His hands trembled as he wedged it against the lock. The first strike echoed through the attic, metal against metal, each blow louder than the last. With a final violent snap, the lock broke free, clattering onto the floor. The silence that followed was suffocating. Michael reached for the trunk's lid and lifted it slowly. The hinges groaned, and the smell of aged paper and something faintly metallic rose from within. He angled the flashlight inside. Stacks of ledgers filled the trunk, their spines cracked and pages stuffed with loose notes. Envelopes bulged with photographs, and tucked into the corner was a thick folder labeled in his father's handwriting, "Cole." Michael's breath caught as he opened the folder. Inside were documents detailing transactions, money laundering schemes, fraudulent contracts, lists of names tied to payments. Some of the papers bore signatures, and more than once the name Richard Cole appeared, written in bold ink. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her voice low. "This is evidence, real evidence, enough to bury him." Elizabeth stepped forward slowly, her hands wringing together. "Your father never showed me that folder. He told me it was too dangerous. If Cole knew David was keeping these records, it would have destroyed us." Michael pulled out one of the photographs. It showed his father and Cole standing together. But unlike the casual snapshots he had found earlier, this one was different. They were at a desk, papers spread before them, and both men looked deadly serious. On the back, his father had written a single word: leverage. His throat tightened. His father had been preparing for a war he never fought, gathering proof but never using it. And now that responsibility had shifted to him. He sifted deeper into the trunk and uncovered letters, written in his father's unmistakable hand. They weren't addressed to anyone specific, but read like confessions, explanations of choices made and regrets carried. One line struck Michael hard. "If my children ever find this, know that silence was not weakness, it was survival." His chest ached as he read it. For years he had seen his father as a tyrant of rules, a man who demanded obedience without reason. But now he glimpsed the truth. David Harris had been terrified, trapped between loyalty to his family and the danger of betraying powerful men. Michael closed the folder and sat back, his hands shaking. He wanted to stop Cole. He just couldn't do it without risking us. Sarah touched his shoulder. "But you can. You have the evidence. You've already taken it to Morris. This could finally end what your father couldn't." Elizabeth shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Or it could destroy us all. Don't you understand? Cole won't let this go. The moment he learns you've opened that trunk, you'll be marked, just like your father was." Michael looked from his mother's tearful face to Sarah's determined one, then back to the trunk. The truth was finally out in the open, but with it came a choice his father had never been able to make. The attic no longer held silence. It held the weight of a decision that could change everything. The days following the trunk's opening were filled with restless silence. Michael kept the folder hidden beneath his bed, unable to shake the feeling that every sound outside the house was someone watching, waiting. Elizabeth moved like a shadow, avoiding his eyes, while Sarah urged him to take the evidence back to Detective Morris. But before he could decide, the confrontation he had feared came to him. It happened on a cool evening, the autumn air sharp with the scent of burning leaves. Michael had stepped out to the porch for a breath of calm when he noticed a black sedan idling at the end of the street. The sight made his skin prickle. He had seen the same car earlier that week near the grocery store. Moments later, footsteps crunched on the gravel path leading up to the porch. A man emerged from the dim light, a man with broad shoulders, a weathered face, and eyes that carried both authority and menace. Richard Cole. "Evening, Michael," Cole said smoothly, as if greeting an old acquaintance. "Mind if I come in?" Michael's grip tightened on the porch railing. "What do you want?" Cole smiled faintly, stepping closer. "I want what belongs to me. Your father kept things that didn't concern him. Now I hear they've fallen into your hands. Let's not play games. You know exactly what I'm talking about." Michael's heart pounded, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "If you're talking about the trunk, it wasn't yours to begin with." "My father had his reasons for keeping it." Cole's expression hardened, the friendly facade slipping. "Your father was a fool. He thought he could outmaneuver me, hold on to leverage he'd never dare use. And now you're walking down the same road. Don't make his mistake. Hand over the evidence, and this ends quietly." Elizabeth appeared in the doorway behind Michael, her voice trembling. "Please, Richard, leave us alone. Haven't you done enough?" Cole glanced at her, his tone sharp. "Elizabeth, you always were the voice of reason. Convince your son to do the smart thing. This isn't his fight." Michael stepped in front of his mother, his jaw tight. "It is my fight. You broke into this house. You threatened us. And you expect me to hand over the only proof of what you've done?" Cole's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand the world you've stepped into. That evidence isn't a shield. It's a target on your back. Keep it, and you'll find out just how far I'll go to protect myself." Before Michael could respond, headlights swept across the yard as another car pulled up. Detective Morris stepped out, his hand resting on his holstered weapon, his gaze locked on Cole. "Richard Cole," Morris said firmly, "we've been waiting a long time for you to slip. And here you are, threatening the son of the man you ruined." Cole's smirk returned, though his eyes flickered with unease. Detective Morris, always chasing shadows, never catching them. "Careful, or you'll bite off more than you can chew." Morris stepped closer, his tone cold. "I've seen the documents, Cole. Your time's running out. Walk away while you still can, or next time it won't be a conversation. It'll be cuffs." Cole studied Michael one last time, his expression unreadable. Then, with a mocking bow, he turned and strode back to his car. The sedan's engine roared, and the vehicle disappeared into the night. Elizabeth gripped Michael's arm, her voice breaking. "He won't stop. He never does." Michael's chest burned with both fear and defiance. "Then neither will I." Morris looked at him, the weight of the moment heavy in his eyes. "You've just drawn the line, Michael. Now there's no turning back." The night settled into silence again, but it was no longer the silence of secrets. It was the silence before a storm. The tension from Cole's visit lingered like smoke in the air. Michael barely slept, his mind replaying the confrontation again and again, his father's enemy standing on their porch demanding silence, threatening their lives. Yet what stayed with him most was Cole's final look, cold and calculating, as if promising this wasn't over. The next morning, Detective Morris returned to the Harris house. His expression was grim, but his eyes carried determination. "Michael, I won't sugarcoat this. Cole is dangerous, but last night he slipped. He showed his hand, and now we can use that against him." Michael sat at the kitchen table, the folder of documents between them. His mother hovered nearby, her face lined with worry. "So what happens now?" Michael asked. Morris leaned forward. "We build a case. These ledgers and photos tie him to fraud, but I need more. With your father's records and the break-in, we can get a warrant to search his properties. If we find corroborating evidence, Cole's empire crumbles." Elizabeth spoke for the first time, her voice quiet, but edged with fear. "And if he finds out what you're doing before then?" Morris looked at her steadily. "Then we protect you. I'll assign officers to patrol the area. But I need you all to understand. This is a fight that won't end overnight. David started it, but now it's in your hands." Michael felt the weight of the words pressing down on him. For years he had lived under his father's rules without understanding the reason. Now he realized those rules were born of fear, of a man trying to control the uncontrollable. But Michael wasn't willing to live in fear any longer. "Do it," he said firmly. "Go after him. Use what my father left. It's time this ends." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Morris called with an update. A raid had been carried out on one of Cole's warehouses. Inside, investigators found financial records, hidden accounts, and ties to the very disappearances Michael had read about in the old newspaper clippings. Cole's network wasn't invincible anymore. It was cracking. Michael listened to the report in silence, his chest tight. When the call ended, he turned to Elizabeth. She sat quietly on the sofa, staring at the floor. "Mum," he said softly, "you were right. Dad kept all of this because he thought it was the only way to protect us. He wasn't just being strict, he was terrified." Tears welled in her eyes. "He wanted to keep you safe, but he carried the guilt of it every day. He thought silence was strength, but in the end it broke him." Michael sat beside her, his voice gentle. "Maybe. But he also gave us the tools to finish what he couldn't. That means he didn't fail completely." Elizabeth rested her hand on his. For the first time since his father's death, Michael saw something soften in her expression, a mixture of sorrow and release. Sarah arrived later that night, her presence steady and grounding. She listened as Michael explained the raid, then smiled faintly. "So your father's silence wasn't the end of the story. You're giving it an ending he couldn't." Michael nodded, though his mind lingered on the cost. "It's not over yet, but at least we're not running anymore." The three of them sat together in the quiet house, the attic above no longer just a chamber of secrets, but a vault of truth finally exposed. Outside, the night was still, and for the first time Michael felt a flicker of peace. His father's shadow was still there, but it no longer loomed with unanswered questions. The storm had broken, and though more trials lay ahead, the silence that once ruled their home was gone, replaced by truth and the strength to face it. The weeks that followed felt like stepping into a different life. The attic was no longer a forbidden place looming over Michael's childhood. It was simply a room filled with dust and boxes, emptied of its power now that its secrets had been exposed. Richard Cole's empire cracked wider with every passing day as Detective Morris and his team dismantled his operations. Though Cole himself still fought fiercely against the charges, the weight of evidence David Harris had guarded for decades now worked against him. For the first time in years, Elizabeth began to breathe easier. She no longer jumped at every noise outside the window or hesitated at the sound of the mail. One morning as she folded laundry in the living room, she looked at Michael and said quietly, "Your father would be proud of you. He didn't have the strength to see it through, but you did." Michael swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I used to think he was just a strict man who wanted control. Now I know he was a man who carried too much, who chose silence because he thought it was the only way to protect us. He wasn't perfect, Mom, but maybe he was braver than I gave him credit for." Elizabeth reached out, placing her hand on his cheek. "And maybe now we can forgive him, for the secrets, for the fear. Maybe now we can let him rest." Sarah continued to stand by Michael's side through it all. Late one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the last streaks of sunlight fade, she spoke with quiet conviction. "You turned your father's silence into action. That attic used to terrify you, but you faced it. You didn't just open a locked room. You opened your past and chose to write the ending yourself." Michael smiled faintly, feeling the truth in her words. "I thought the attic was a curse, but maybe it was his way of leaving us the key. He couldn't say it out loud, but he wanted us to know, to finish what he started." The house itself seemed lighter now. What had once been oppressive walls of unspoken rules now felt like a place of closure. Michael walked through its rooms differently, no longer as a son haunted by shadows, but as a man who had faced them. One afternoon, he climbed the attic stairs alone. The trunk was gone, secured in Morris's custody as evidence, but the space remained. He stood in the middle of the dusty floor, the light from the small window spilling across the boards. For the first time in his life, the silence there wasn't threatening. It was peaceful, like a secret finally set free. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "It's over, Dad." Back downstairs, Claire arrived with her children, their laughter filling the halls. Elizabeth's smile, though tinged with sorrow, was genuine. The house, once heavy with silence, now carried the sounds of family again. Michael knew the scars would remain, questions about his father's choices, the risks that still lingered with Cole's fight in court, but he also knew they no longer had to live in fear. His father's legacy was no longer just silence and secrecy. It was resilience, the determination to protect and now the courage to face the truth. As the story of the Harris family's attic comes to a close, I want to thank you for staying with us through every twist and turn. If you found this journey gripping and meaningful, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story filled with mystery, resilience, and discovery. And before you go, don't stop here. Click on the video suggested on your screen to continue exploring stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The attic is quiet now, but the echoes of its truth will remain forever.